Hello, friends. I'm so glad you could be with me today as we spend time together in God's Word in the Unfolding the Word ministry. We're in the midst of our study of the book of Daniel. We're pushing on toward the end of Daniel. We're now in chapter 11, looking at the final part of the visions that were given to Daniel by the Lord that introduce us to God's plan of history. This final vision in chapters 10, 11, and 12 give us even more details about strategic events that intersect the Jewish people in the period leading up to the first coming of Christ, and then in that final segment of time, the 70th week, the tribulation years, of things that are affecting the Jewish people and the world as Christ returns a second time. At any rate, today I want to read, as we begin to look at the details of things, out of verse 2 of chapter 11. And now I will show you the truth. Behold, 3 more kings shall arise in Persia, and then a 4th, who shall be far richer than them all. And when he becomes strong through his riches, he shall stir up all against the kingdom of Greece. We are talking again about this vision that came in the 3rd year of Cyrus, the emperor of Persia, to Daniel. He's in his mid-80s by this point. And this particular vision, the most extended of the visions in the book of Daniel, gives us a number of details about time of conflict. Time of conflict that expresses itself prior to the coming of Christ in his first coming, and that it later expresses itself just prior to the second coming. It's like a breaking out of a conflict that's continued to exist throughout history, that conflict behind the scenes that we were looking at in the last couple of days before that, the invisible war that Ephesians 6 communicates to us. The first stop now in the details of this period of conflict, periods plural of conflict in the history of the Jews, is stop number 1, the history of the Persian Empire up to the time where they lose their empire to Alexander the Great. The verse 2 that I read to you picks up on this very vision. We already knew from chapter 2, from chapter 7, and in fact from chapter 8, that the Persian Empire was not going to last. It was a great empire, more extensive than Babylon ever was, but it would not last. It would be replaced by another empire that then in turn would be replaced. At any rate, we already know that that coming empire we've seen already is Alexander's empire, the empire of the Greeks, spreading across the known world. Now, in this sort of final picture of that era in the unfolding of history, God lets us know in advance that there are going to be 4 key rulers of the Medo Persian Empire, 4 that would distinguish themselves in various ways. The first of those key rulers was the beginner of it, Cyrus himself, who is the current emperor of Persia. But there would be 4 additional kings beyond him, because remember, that's already the era that Daniel is in, who would also be significant and noteworthy. The first of those was going to be his son, his elder son, who ruled for 7 years following the death of Cyrus. Then another ruler, king, would follow the death of his son, who died quickly after that period of time, and he is often called in history the pseudo-Smerdis. And you don't have to remember that name, but just historians show us that there was yet this person playing, and he ruled for just a year and then was done away with. The third king, however, is one of the most significant of the kings of the Persian Empire. That is Darius the First, or Darius the Great. This is not the Darius who was in charge of the Babylon province of the broader empire when Daniel was serving him in the first couple of years of the empire. This is a later Darius the Great. Why he stands to the front, why he's identified by God in this particular way, is that he attempted to conquer Greece. In 490 BC, he got his armies together, armies before this time that had been essentially invincible, and he went across the Aegean and sought to take over Greece, or the city-states at least, that made up Greece in that era of history. And his effort came to grief at the Battle of Marathon. It was the first time the Persian Empire ever had a setback in its rapid expansion and overcoming of other kingdoms. The armies of Persia limped back, in a way, into Asia Minor, and gave up the conquest of Greece for a short time. But it was a great embarrassment. It was a crack in the invincibility, so to speak. And one of the consequences of that, inevitably, were that many of the conquered peoples who made up the Persian Empire would begin to have thoughts, I wonder if the real strength of this empire is diminishing. Maybe this is the time to rebel against the emperors. And so there was a great deal of attention among the leaders as to how to shore up strength. And the best way that came out of that was the decision, we're going to have to go back and try to conquer Greece. We can't just give up. We're going to have to go back. And that was done by the next of these kings, Xerxes, who was the son of Darius. He reigned from 486 to 465 BC. Taking his father's mantle and in obligation and call, he mobilized the armies of the Medo Persian Empire and attacked Greece once again. By the way, of interest to you, it may be that Xerxes is the one who married Esther, and the book of Esther is about that. At any rate, Xerxes takes the armies of the Medo Persian Empire to Greece once again. His attempted invasion, and this time it was a much more massive army than his father had taken, his invasion, first of all, is slowed down at Thermopylae. And that is a classic episode in history where 300 Spartans went and defended the pass for a period of time and slowed down all of these massive numbers of soldiers, the 300 Spartans. Well, after the defeat of the Spartans, he had some degree of success, but he was ultimately defeated by the navies at the Battle of Salamis, and that was in 480 BC. And that setback, because that would have cut off his ways of retreat, forced him to go back over and return to the Medo-Persian Empire region and let Greece alone. It was an area that began to stir a lot of more concern about the stability of the empire. By the way, it was after that defeat that Esther came on the scene. And part of the intensity of the response to her forerunner, the previous queen by the king Xerxes, was probably tied to her refusal to do what he said was just another way of indicating to the broader empire that he had lost some of his power and control. That's for another time. But nonetheless, that's in history who we're talking about. The end result of both of these invasions by Darius the Great and by Xerxes stirred within the Greek peoples great animosity and hatred toward the Medo-Persians. And so for the next 150 years, they stewed in that anger. Every problem that the Greeks had was ultimately, in their mind, attributable to the hated Medo-Persians. And a determination to destroy that empire just grew generation after generation after generation. Now, by the way, there were no further kings mentioned here until we come to Xerxes' son, a man named Artaxerxes. And Artaxerxes ruled the Medo-Persian Empire at the time of Ezra and Nehemiah. We've already talked about him. And this Artaxerxes is the one who issued the command for Jerusalem to rebuild its walls and fortify, probably partially tied in the human level of it to fearing the western side of the empire and wanting a mobilized city there. But in God's plan, it was a way to begin the countdown toward the first coming of the Messiah. At any rate, at the end of that period of time, Alexander, the Macedonian Greek Empire leader, ends up taking his armies into the Medo-Persian region. And Darius III was the final of the rulers of the Medo-Persian Empire, and he was defeated by Alexander. We'll turn attention to that coming Greek Empire and what other details were told here about it tomorrow. So join me then, won't you? Isn't it wonderful that we serve a God of history? He can tell us in advance what's going to happen, and we can take it to the bank because he knows what will happen, because history unfolds according to his sovereign plan. Have a great day.